Hey friend, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I'm excited to be highlighting Half-Life 2 Episode 1. And before we dive in, I just wanted to say thanks so much for watching. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking and subscribing and supporting a small creator such as myself. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the game and have your support in future videos if you enjoy them. The story of Half-Life 2 Episode 1 picks up immediately after the events of Half-Life 2. You're once again in the shoes of Gordon Freeman, trying to escape the collapsing City 17 alongside Alex Vance, while of course dealing with the fallout of the previous game's climax. And right off the bat, I'm going to say, my take might surprise you. I don't think most people say Episode 1 is the best, but I really want to make a case for that. And I want to get to it shortly, of course, but let's just discuss the high level of the game before we talk a little bit about the details. Episode 1 originally released in June of 2006, so about a year and a half after Half-Life 2, and of course was developed and published by Valve, who we know for such great titles such as Portal and Left 4 Dead and Team Fortress 2. I think one thing I've been calling out is that all these titles are almost considered retro by today's standards. So we need to get some new Hallmark games, Valve. Come on, start making them. But a little bit of development trivia. The game was originally titled Half-Life 2 Aftermath, and Valve shifted to an episodic content to attempt to deliver more frequent content to players. So Episode 1 was the first of a planned trilogy that would showcase kind of upgrades to the Source Engine over those years as well. So one of the big things that Episode 1 did, for example, is add in high dynamic range lighting and improve facial animations, both of which were pretty cool. And I do have to say that HDR is, for me, kind of a little up in the air as to whether it's good or not still. I've used it to play games, and the PlayStation 5, for example, has a ton of games that support HDR, and my TV does, of course. But I've found that capturing footage and then trying to record it out to a broad audience makes it challenging to work with HDR because certain displays don't have it, certain softwares you can't render in it, or you have to render specifically in different ways, or you combine capture card gameplay with other camera setups that have HDR and it doesn't work. And then the same goes for translating it to video games. I've just never found that it does so much visually for me that it's super impressive. But that was a huge thing going on in the mid-2000s was HDR. This was like the new big technology. You know, a big idea behind releasing this episodic content, not only to display some of the updates to Source Engine along the way, was of course to offer more frequent content to gamers, as I mentioned. So they didn't want people waiting years and years to have to experience a little bit more of Half-Life. And, you know, here we are in 2025, and I mean, has that situation been alleviated? I don't know. We're still waiting for Episode 3. Maybe, maybe not. It'll come along someday. Anyway, at some point in the development, Valve officially renamed the game to Episode 1 once they had committed to that more episodic structure. And this announcement also clarified that there was going to be a planned trilogy of these follow-up games to come. One of the things that was pretty cool is that the marketing emphasized Alex Vance's expanded role throughout this journey, and of course Gordon Freeman's continued journey through the collapse of City 17. And when the game was released, it was distributed both digitally via Steam as well as through retail channels. And Valve's use of Steam for distribution was still kind of in its infancy stages. It was a relatively novel concept still at the time. So Episode 1 really helped to solidify the platform's role in digital game delivery because it was the first big launch title where it wasn't just like something you could download and run your games through, but now it was like, hey, you can go get this game and begin using Steam as a platform for purchasing and managing your games. I personally recall the days when I would go to Best Buy and surf the aisles for video games to check out, and on one occasional trip, I went with my father and begged him to buy this game for me. We were living in Texas at the time and, you know, didn't exactly have a lot of money and so on. But one thing that was really nice about Episode 1 was that it retailed for only $20. So it was a very quick, convincing conversation, at least from my perspective. And of course, once I got the game, I blitzed through it. And these little factors are one of the areas in which I want to start addressing the critiques that I've often heard about Episode 1. So right off the bat, I understand that this is surely a bit of a spicy take. It's not likely that a person's favorite Half-Life game is going to be this in-between title that's only a handful of hours long. If they were to choose, and of course I would say that Half-Life 2 as a whole, all the games are fantastic, and really nowadays you would play the games as one experience, but I do want to still think about them in the context of when they were released and that they were individual titles themselves. So really just take a moment to hear me out. There are some pretty genuine and upfront critiques one could have against episode 1, especially its shorter kind of 4 or 5 hour runtime. But that Valve did retail it for much cheaper and communicated this timeline up front in the marketing and kind of explaining to the fans why they were going for this more episodic style in order to push out the content quicker, did kind of help alleviate some of those critiques in my opinion. I've also heard that the limited innovation and recycled assets is also a common note amongst people that say, hey, episode 1 wasn't that special. But I don't mind that too much personally, since it is a direct continuation from Half-Life 2. It makes it easier to jump in right away and play the game with a solid continuity. So for some as well, such as myself, this jump from console to PC or back really did make a huge uplift. So if you were going to play episode 1, perhaps you experienced it for the first time when you picked up the orange box. And so if you played Half-Life 2 on Xbox and then moved to getting the orange box on 360 or PC or so on, you were going to have a very positive experience in terms of the quality improvement moving between the two titles. And so again, it's just something that I kind of brush off when I think about why I enjoy episode 1 so much. There is finally as well the common complaint that the narrative bridge in which episode 1 happens is really just this transitional episode that takes place between Half-Life 2 and episode 2, where a lot of the big key moments are happening, and episode 1 is just kind of this adventure that gets us from point A to B so we can experience those two titles. But one of the things I would argue is that if we ever got episode 3 and got to see how ultimately all of that plays out, we might have a different vision in how we view episode 2 as well, and a take that would probably be likely similar to how we think about episode 1 today. One of the things that I think drives the community preference for episode 2 over 1, I do believe has to do with the fact that the series kind of ended there and ends on such a climax and a cliffhanger, which overall, when you think about it, really puts it in this pedestal of saying, hey, this is fantastic. I mean, look what happened, the drama around the game and the freezing of development on episode 3 and so on, and how long we've waited certainly builds the hype and puts episode 2 in this place of being the championed version of the two. But I do like episode 2 a lot. I'm just saying that I think it's something that I can look past because of the fact that in an alternate universe, we might have seen that title very differently and maybe similar to how we think about episode 1 even. All considered with those things in mind, I do understand that I have to defend the position that episode 1 is the best and it's my favorite. And I want to start with this philosophy, and it comes from an American chef and entrepreneur by the name of Thomas Keller. And if you've ever been to a fine dining restaurant, you would know right off the bat that there's this funny idea that when you go to the restaurant and you get these fancy, like get a pea mousse appetizer, it's so tiny. There's like, you get this tiny little spoon and you eat it and there's nothing to eat. You got like 2 calories out of the whole meal and boom, the dish is gone. And Thomas Keller is a chef who describes why fine dining dishes tend to be so small in a quote that he shared on his official website, which reflects his kind of culinary philosophy rooted in the law of diminishing returns. That quote from Thomas goes, "Our whole menu is based on the law of diminishing returns. The most compelling portion of a dish is in the first 3 or 4 bites. And with the first bite, you're getting into it. By the second bite, you start to realize it. And it is the 3rd or 4th bites you get the maximum appreciation and pleasure from that dish. And you keep eating because of that memory of it being really extraordinary. But was it as good at the end as it was that 2nd, 3rd, or 4th bite? No, it typically isn't." This statement does a really good job of emulating and informing my perspective when playing video games on the discussion of content length, as really the quality and the excitement of me to want a little bit more out of that game is what I'm truly pursuing in the hopes of finding something that I'm really excited about. So if a game is shorter, to me it wouldn't necessarily mean it's worse than a longer game. On top of that, the first hour of the game is pretty heavily scripted with a lot of focus on building Alex's character. So of course she's prominently featured in Half-Life 2, but there are big spells of the game where you won't see Alex and won't interact with her. And this game really puts to the forefront that, hey, Alex Vance is going to be your companion throughout the run of this title. And I'll say that as a companion, I find her to be pretty okay. I love the performance that Alex brings to the table, and it's fun to have a companion along for the journey since Gordon doesn't really talk. But one of the things I always found funny about Alex's character throughout the titles is I found my philosophy clashing with hers at times in the series, and her approach to situations, it doesn't really always align with the way that I would kind of make my way through it. So these early segments kind of feel slow and a bit unreal as I'm kind of working with Alex to get through them. That said, overall, the commitment to creating those tighter character dynamics is well done here by Valve throughout the course of the game. I think we really build into what will become episode 2 and your relationship with Alex and connection with some of the other characters you meet along the way. Another thing that the opening does that I did really appreciate is how it restricts your weapon use to just the gravity gun. I mean, you don't even get the crowbar until halfway through this episode, and it's a brilliant way to kind of open the game with a brilliant tool. One of the most iconic mechanics from Half-Life 2 is manipulation of its physics environments using the gravity gun. And this limitation opens up a lot of room for experimentation early on in this title. So, most players will probably default to blasting on zombies if they have an option, but if you lean into the physics sandbox, there's a lot of fun to be had. So whether you're on the Citadel trying to protect the elevator you're on from these massive structures that are collapsing around you, or are in the underground fighting zombies, and all you can really do is point your flashlight or for Alex to shoot, or pick up a box and shoot it at a zombie and use your environment to your advantage. I really did have a lot of fun with this mechanic, and I like that Valve highlighted it early on in the title. Later, you and Alex, after getting away from the Citadel, traverse the underground sections of City 17, and these areas, in my opinion, are a huge step up in engagement overall in Half-Life 2. So you're going to be fighting off antlions and zombies and combines a little bit in these pitch black tunnels. And as I mentioned, you're often using your flashlight not just to see around you, but to guide Alex's actions throughout the area, which was a really cool way to build on existing mechanics. And another really great piece that I love, this set piece, is where you're going to spend some time shooting vehicles and directing them into antlion pits to block their spawning. And so I found it to be really clever. I found it to create many tense moments throughout the game, and just quite satisfying when you get to the point where you've kind of resolved those, because there's both ongoing combat and these more puzzle-solving elements happening simultaneously. So yes, the narrative is kind of this single objective run based on escaping City 17, and the pressure to do so does remain present throughout the game. So while it is a shorter game, what it does with its time is really valuable in the sense of keeping you there without a pause and pushing you forward in these tense encounters. And so I really did like that about what the narrative was doing. While it's not necessarily progressing the story, you're along for this experience that goes for what would realistically feel like your escape from a city, a few hours just to get out of there. This is, of course, accompanied by a story that is pretty linear as a result, with no real branching paths or player-driven choices. It's just a tightly scripted run, and that's what really works well for its pacing, but of course limits its replay variability. But I do like just kind of jumping into this title and having fun with some of those set pieces that they built out for it. The writing is solid where it happens, and especially in Alex's interactions, she's really a driving force in this title, and I appreciated the added depth we get in interacting with her and many of the other characters that make a return too throughout the course of this game. In dire moments, I felt like we get a lot more out of them versus the many times in Half-Life 2 where you're traversing alone as Gordon, or will occasionally come across a random resistance NPC who will give you a little bit of directory in terms of where you need to go, but that's about it. So I really did like the development of characters overall. And in the writing, of course, we get Valve's signature dry humor and subtle emotional beats, and those continue to be present, though the early game does lean a little bit too hard into exposition at times. Overall, when the game gets going, I think it's very natural and builds well on the characters that Valve continues to develop. All said on the story front, I just wanted to say that I really like the narrative here in episode 1 and the delivery of its narrative too. It's a pretty quick and linear experience, which these days I've tended to lean towards, and so I have a bit of a bias in terms of my perspective on this game, its story, and its length. The game does a lot to continue building its characters and creating those interactions with them throughout its runtime, and I really did like the overarching escape from City 17 experience that Valve keeps here. So narratively, you get everything and some more from the characters that we know, and you get that in a faster format. Similar to other Half-Life titles, the core loop here is really a mix of environmental puzzles, combat, and scripted sequences. You'll alternate between fighting combine forces, zombies, antlions, etc., navigating hazards, and solving physics-based puzzles. The game is also a first-person shooter, quite obviously, but it does have a strong emphasis on physics, something you don't see in a lot of FPS games, even to this day. So the gravity gun itself remains a standout and allows you to, of course, manipulate objects creatively, and the early game is restricted to this weapon, so you really get to use it a lot in most of the early combat encounters, and resolving them, like pushing the cars in antlion pits, which I mentioned, are really cool. These are just ideas that Valve had yet to come up with when they produced Half-Life 2, but I can tell that they were sticking them somewhere in an inventory so that they could pull them back out and give them a try. So aside from these restrictions, combat itself is pretty similar to Half-Life 2, just some newer encounters with an intermix of combat and puzzle solving in some instances. No new weapons though, which is a bit of a bummer, but the variety of weapons that was present in Half-Life 2 is back, and that variety is already quite strong, so I didn't really see too many concerns with that. The environments here are mostly linear, with occasional open areas for combat, and the underground sections are particularly well designed in my opinion, balancing a really good amount of tension and exploration throughout. The puzzles are never slowing you down and are really well integrated into the flow of combat, and I thought this was a great evolution from what Valve was already doing in Half-Life 2, because the skirmishes as a result often feel more claustrophobic and hectic in City 17's underground, where you'll spend a good portion of the game, and these create a more intimate atmosphere for the combat overall. By and large, for me, this creates the most intense counters overall in the series, in my opinion. So since you will occasionally be swarmed by the creatures in the dark or cramped in these environments, the other games, yes, they do a bit of that here and there, but not so much all at once. And so if you really champion the horror aspects of the Half-Life games, this is really the peak of that style in my perspective. Of course, we don't get some of that vibe and atmosphere that you do in Ravenholm, but the intenseness at which these encounters are happening while fighting creatures in Ravenholm, and of course having to take advantage of some trap style physics work similar to Ravenholm. Of course, there's no traps, but having to use the gravity gun to defeat a lot of those early enemies and zombies and such really do keep the pressure on throughout this game, which I liked a lot. I mentioned this too, but when you get into those environments, I really like the mechanics around the flashlight tactics early on, for example, where you'll be in these pitch black environments and you need to leverage your flashlight to give Alex targets to shoot. So this creates like a really interesting partner dynamic where you have to work together best to resolve the action sets, which were cool. And also adds a little bit of that dynamic character relationship building between Gordon and Alex in the moment. This isn't just a scripted sequence where Alex is talking to you and that's building the relationship, but you're working together, you're fighting the enemies together. And I think overall Alex proves to be a pretty competent partner who doesn't really slow you down and helps you out if you help her out, of course. And so I like that dynamic of the game. This will also be hit or miss for some, and I do like these sections that appear in Half-Life 2 and Episode 2. But another thing I wanted to call out that's not present here in Episode 1 is vehicle sections. So when you play either of those other titles, these sections take up a large portion of both of the gameplay experiences here and happen to be absent. So it's a bit of a win in my mind, because since these do not necessarily align with the Half-Life 1 design ethos at its core, where it's really all about traversal and gunplay and solving some of these puzzles, I think we really get the best distilled version, again, of simply what is the best of these three titles, which is just the action and the combat. And so for me, that's excellent design, because the combat encounters were the focus. They were made for Gordon to be on foot at all times. And so Valve really had kind of put up some walls around what exactly they were going to do with the design. And so the environments really do a good job of promoting on-the-fly creativity, and they blend that with action in a very satisfying way, something I don't think the other two titles do as well. All in all, I find Half-Life 2 Episode 1 to have a really great slew of gameplay across its three core sections, which is the Citadel, the Underground, and then the final City 17 rooftop battles. There's a great deal of polish to every moment, and the action set pieces are interwoven well with puzzles and really keep the pressure on throughout the course of the game. And with the gunplay as the focus here, I think Valve deliberately restricts the player in ways to play certain styles and keeps the battling fresh throughout every hour of its pace. And so for me, they really exceed on following up on Half-Life 2's already fantastic gameplay. They build on it in very interesting and creative ways and keep the player engaged so that they can reach that finale, which is Half-Life 2 Episode 2. Something that continues to surprise me with this franchise is how fantastic the sound design is, from voice acting to the sound effects to the music, etc. And Alex here is voiced by Merle Dandridge, who brings a really good warmth and urgency to the role and kind of carries the game, in my opinion. Her performance helps to really ground the game's emotional beats, and being elevated into the game's starring role, essentially because she is the main voice actor for the title, is a perfect fit because Merle is an excellent actor and brings a subtle and well done performance to the game. And while she's not the only one, I really don't have any other issues with other voices. They equally embody their characters, whether it's Barney or Breen or so on and so forth, or even just the random NPCs. They really feel part of the world, and I've always really liked that about the Half-Life games. The sound design too is really immersive, whether it's combine weapons or radio chatter, zombie groans in the dark, antlion insectoid screeches, all of these create a palpably tense environment, and these cues are crisp and effective and really pull you into the world, and that's accompanied by a fantastic quality of sound. I think a big part of it is the spatial audio that's been designed into this game, which really helps build the tension, especially when you're in those darker areas. And Valve rendered the sound within the 3D environments themselves, which makes leveraging the audio to navigate and prepare for combat encounters even more effective on top of that. And I really like that if you're taking advantage of it. And the soundtrack is nothing to sleep on either. I love Kelly Bailey and his work, and he returns here, of course, to do the soundtrack for Episode 1. And in Episode 1, it's a little more atmospheric and a little more reactive. This Half-Life 2 Episode 1 work didn't radically depart from previous compositions, but it did reflect a shift in kind of more tone-leaning, more ambient tension scoring to match the game's tighter pacing and darker environments. So one of the things that was newly incorporated here is Bailey did a little more of leaning into reactive scoring, and that's where kind of music swells or fades based on combat intensity or narrative beats or kind of whatever you're doing in the moment while playing the title. And so this really helped reinforce the feeling of urgency and collapse around City 17 without overwhelming the player with these kind of constant musical presences or cues. And so overall, I think this was really well done and just made for a great musical experience. All in all, the audio department crushed it. I think it's a really big thing that shines in these titles on top of what is already a fantastic story and gameplay, just kind of like that little cherry on top, and one that I always look for, listen for, and I'm excited to talk about. So next thing I want to describe is a bit just in the visuals department, thinking about graphics, etc. And by 2006 standards, Episode 1 really looked great. Technical lighting upgrades and facial animations were really cutting edge at the time, and Half-Life 2's character animations were definitely more in depth. They allowed for more environmental cueing for Alex, for example, and you're going to spend a lot of time with her throughout the game, so that's super important. And as well kind of creates more character movements that are realistic in comparison to Half-Life 2. Just that little added bump begins to build this world and bring it to life in different ways that maybe we didn't notice so much in Half-Life 2. And I also love the dynamic aspects of the world as, City 17 is crumbling and its infrastructure just creates this very interesting visual aesthetic. And newer technologies, of course, come into play too. Things like HDR, which I mentioned was new to this series in Half-Life 2 Episode 1. You get the underground sections, they're filled with this dense fog and flickering lights and reactive shadows, which really enhance the horror-like atmosphere, and were just totally excellent. Overall, when I think about the three titles across the Half-Life 2 series, this game to me has the most consistent and present and alive tone and vibe and atmosphere to it, which combined with thoughtful gameplay sections make for the best distilled version of a Half-Life experience. And that's something I want to keep badgering on is distilled, because when you think about the core of Half-Life games, for me, I think Episode 1 does the best job of capturing that all in a bottle, a small little bottle for you to enjoy. And I like that, because if I ever want a bit more out of this game franchise, I know I can pick this title up in particular and beat it in an afternoon without any frills or drawn out sections that just allow me to really enjoy the gravity gun, the Half-Life 2 gameplay, and a little bit of variety from all the enemies that you meet across the close fighter game. Yeah, overall, it's really just hard for me to say anything bad about Half-Life 2 Episode 1, or have even a critical opinion that doesn't skew in a positive way. Half-Life 2 Episode 1 to me is a solid continuation of the series. Yes, for me it kind of stumbles a little bit out of the gate. The Citadel opening is a bit dull and structurally incoherent, and the early focus on Alex, while narratively justified, does slow the pace. But still, the gravity gun focused gameplay and the underground set pieces redeem the experience for me. Episode 1 definitely has some of my favorite action set pieces, and whether you're getting ambushed by zombies as you collapse through an apartment floor, or battling antlions across a multi-tiered parking structure while you're searching for vehicles to block their pits with, I just thought it was really cool that these set pieces were so well thought out and put together. These moments of like flashlight guided combat and physics-based puzzles are really where the game shines, and I think does a really good job of summarizing the strengths of Valve as a company and the games they make, which is this intermix of excellent gunplay and also very creative physics puzzles. You get those kind of split out across the other titles, but here they really thought about how to put them together and create pieces that were going to make the player very excited and find themselves in tense encounters, and I think it just does it a little better than the other games, and that's what I love so much about the title. Going back to the chef Thomas Keller's philosophy, Half-Life 2 Episode 1 for me is that third bite in the Half-Life 2 experience. Across the first game, we get the taste and we begin to realize exactly what this journey is going to be like. And now is where the fun really begins, is when we open up Episode 1 and make that transitional bridge towards what will be the grand finale, Episode 2, and it's kind of brilliant art. So I really did appreciate that about the game, and just because it's that in-between bite, it's still an important one that really opens up avenues for us to see what's coming, but also know where we are now. It doesn't take us far and it doesn't open up new avenues necessarily, but I really like this game's story and where it's taking us. It built a lot of hype for me once I completed it back in the day, and of course right as I completed it this week playing it, and made it so easy for me to dive into Episode 2 without having to think whether I wanted to or not. And all in all, it could be my favorite Half-Life experience for its tight gameplay, its narrative development. You could dive in at any time, with or without background knowledge on the series, and really have a great time with this title, and you can beat it in an afternoon. So put all that together and you get anything that a Half-Life game is going to offer in the best distilled way. And those are the reasons that I champion Half-Life 2 Episode 1 so much, and why I think you should reconsider where it stands in your overall ranking, because I think it's an excellent game and one that does a lot for me to just enjoy the Half-Life 2 experience overall. I've played these games so many times over the years. Coming into this, of course, for me, Half-Life 2 Episode 1 wasn't that highlight. I wasn't expecting to enjoy it as much as I did, but it really did blow me away overall in its structure, in its gameplay, and I had a lot of fun playing it, and I think that the quality of that experience really speaks for itself. Yes, it's not the longest Half-Life game. It has a little more of a restricted gameplay style and narrative experience, because it's really just this transitional bridge between the second and Episode 2, and we're really just escaping the game. It has one core objective. But I love all those things about it, and I really appreciated it for what it was. And so I also appreciate you checking out my video and hearing out my thoughts. How do you feel about Half-Life 2 Episode 1? Would love to know what you think. And overall, just really appreciate you watching my video. If you like the video, please consider subscribing and liking the video, of course. Both of those things mean so much to me. And for a small creator such as myself, it's just a total win to know that someone's out there hearing out my thoughts on the title, but also sharing theirs. So please do so. Anyways, other than that, I just wanted to say, stay well, stay healthy. Look forward to seeing you guys next week. All right, peace.